My name is Ben Knight, and I'm the Director for Language and Pedagogical Research at Cambridge University Press, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. So here in Cambridge, we've been working on how the pandemic is impacting on educational policy and practice. And one of the most important aspects of this has been its impact on social equality and equity. And it's clear to everyone that the pandemic is impacting on education generally, that everyone is affected. 1.5 billion children, 75% of enrolled students in 140 countries have been out of school during lockdown. But is that impact happening in the same way for everyone? Is it the case that students from disadvantaged backgrounds are more negatively affected than students from advantaged backgrounds? Is COVID-19 increasing social inequality through its impact on education? We're going to try to tackle this question, these issues, in three sections. First of all, we're going to look at what the impact of COVID-19 has been on education, and particularly on disadvantaged students. And secondly, we're going to look at what can be done to mitigate the negative impacts of the pandemic on education, on social equity. And thirdly, we will talk through what the significance of all this is for the future of education and what opportunities there are for long-term changes to education. So for this discussion, we've brought together 5 global educational thought leaders to give you the best insights and guidance for these challenging issues. So I'm going to hand over to each of them and ask them to introduce themselves briefly, just saying who they are. First of all, can I start off with you, Rabea?
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much for having me here. I am an academic and a researcher based in Pakistan. I'm an assistant professor at the LUMS, which is a university in Lahore, and a research fellow at Institute for Development and Economic Alternatives based in Lahore.
I'm Rukmini Banerjee, right now in Delhi, work for Pratham. We work in education and in youth skilling in India.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Vikas Pota, and for very much the last decade, I've been focusing on the issue about teacher capacity and teacher status. I was formerly the chief executive and latterly the chairman of the Varkey Foundation, which is a family foundation, and I'm continuing the work in my personal stead.
My name's Charles Clark. I'm now a consultant with Cambridge University Press working on education reform. I have a life prior to that in politics, including being Secretary of State for Education in the UK and dealing with a number of these reform issues.
My name is Ricardo Sabates. I work at the University of Cambridge and I am a member of the REAL Center, which is Research on Equitable Access and Learning, and also CANDER, which is a network for education disability research.
Thank you very much. And if you want more information about each of our panelists, it's on the website, their kind of background and their experience. So first of all, we're going to look at, for the first part, we're going to look at the COVID-related learning loss and perhaps even the learning gap, the adverse effects on the disadvantaged groups. So in what ways has COVID-19 affected people with particular disadvantages? How has it affected all learners? And are there groups which are particularly disadvantaged? Are there actually people who have benefited in unexpected ways? And in your particular context and more widely, is COVID-19 expected to increase economic pressures on households and therefore on their impact on their ability to send children to school? So this is really about what is the impact, and particularly on disadvantaged communities. I think, should we start off with Rukmini on that? Could you tell us your thoughts on those questions?
Very tough question. I was curious to hear what others have to say, because I think what is the impact? It's almost like too early to really understand. I mean, we all know schools are closed and schools close suddenly. So the combination of the suddenness and the unknown duration obviously will have its own implications. But we've been trying to look at what kind of evidence exists, particularly in India, to help us understand what the magnitude of some of this will be. We already know in India as well as in many other parts of the world that although enrollment levels were very high, the basic learning levels, basic reading, basic arithmetic was already quite worryingly low, and that in every grade you had a big distribution of levels that kids were at. So you could be in school for 5 years. The survey that we do every year called the ASER survey, the Annual Status of Education Report, has consistently over the last decade or more shown that even in 5th grade, there is at least half the children who are not yet even at 2nd grade level of learning. So we have to remember that things were already, not great before COVID came. And we know also, I think, from experiences and from evidence that if you know how to swim, you will continue to swim and get to the other side. But if you didn't know how to swim, the chances that you will sink is obviously high. And so we've been trying to look actually to understand what evidence do we have of loss, what is usual year-on-year learning gains, and what are experiences in India where there has been a focused effort made on building basic foundational skills. How much can you achieve in what period of time and at what cost? I think that I heard, thanks to COVID, we can hear each other very easily on such forums. The study from Pakistan, which I think has been, very timely. They released a study very, very timely. Jishnu Das and Tahir Andrabi, right, Rabia? I'm saying it right. Who did a study of the implications, long-term implications of the Pakistan earthquake, which was almost 5 years ago now. And they found that while economic levels of the families affected by the earthquake sort of came back to more or less where they were, but the learning levels of kids in the affected areas continued even 4 years later to be significantly lower than others, which again one can kind of understand. But I think the biggest contribution of that study is to point out that the learning gap or loss or whatever you may call it, only a small part of it can be attributed to the closure. The rest of it is really what happened once the kids came back to school, and there was presumably a rush to get back into curriculum and business as usual. So I think that we are at a very interesting time when if we, plan well, think hard, we could potentially do things which can help to minimize some of the losses that we can plan for. But there may be all kinds of other things that we are not, we're not even aware of today that we will have to deal with.
Thank you very much, Rukmini. That was a really interesting example, and it'd be good now, in fact, to go to Rabea and ask you about your views on this question. And I don't know if you were also involved in that research around the earthquake in Pakistan, because that gives a perspective of many years, which is difficult to have for us in COVID.
Thank you. No, I echo what Rukmini has been saying. So similarly in Pakistan, one of the sort of the crises that the education policy, the education stakeholders were dealing with were very, very low learning outcomes. And suddenly sort of this disruption, which has happened at a scale that has not been experienced before, actually. So even in terms of governance and administration, to think about how to respond at this scale is a particular challenge. In Pakistan. For children, I think, exactly as has been said, this sudden disruption to opportunities to learn, to play. And if I could highlight one other aspect, which is to say sort of these risks and shocks also to their socio-emotional well-being. Because we know when they go to school, it's also about interaction with peers. It's also about sort of going to a safe environment, a nurturing environment. and suddenly to have that disrupted. But in addition to that, we also know that a lot of households are experiencing economic shocks and health shocks, actually. So to suddenly be faced with this uncertainty and having to sort of deal with it and learn on the go. So there's been a recent survey in Pakistan that has asked adults, at least in Punjab, about anxiety levels, and about 42% of them are reporting very severe anxiety levels. So you can only imagine how, the stressful situations that are being faced across the spectrum is something that's a direct outcome. I actually wasn't involved with the study that was mentioned. So as Rukmini mentioned, Yishnu Das, Tahir and Rabi, Asim Khwaja did this study after the 2005 earthquake. But it's sort of the findings that have now been published are helping guide, are helping to guide us in how and what needs to be done when schools reopen, or how we should be imagining risks. There's one other additional sort of aspect I did want to raise. So we've been talking about children who are in school. We're talking about school-going age children, but there's actually, COVID has had quite a big impact also on very young learners. So if you think about the early years, children who are now preparing to go into school, perhaps in the next couple of years, are being impacted because of the severe disruption to health services. So again, a recent survey in Punjab shows that about 13% of households are reporting that at least one child in their household hasn't gotten vaccinated. So quite a lot of progress that had been made in the early development of children to focus on their health, to focus on their nutrition, so that they became prepared learners when they did enter schools in a couple of years, has been disrupted quite strongly. So I think we have to think about different cohorts of children in some ways. Similarly, girls who are in, say, the middle school or high schools are at higher risks of dropping out. The burden of care for them at homes have gone up. So there's risks that they may not be, it may take them longer, or they may not be able to return to schools at all. So how do we think about sort of the risks associated with them? So I think one of the things that has become clear is you almost have to think about different cohorts of children who may be disadvantaged.
Okay, thank you very much, Rabia. That was really interesting. I think now I'm going over to Ricardo. Ricardo, could you share your thoughts on this?
It's fantastic to be in a panel where you can then see the synergies and the points that are being made by Rabia and Rukmini. And very important, as Rabia mentioned, that a school is being a place where it's not only about education, but it's about the other social protection aspects of education, which have been disrupted, which is very, very important. So also not to forget is that we knew a lot about the learning crisis. We already knew that there was a learning crisis, as Rukmini pointed out, many children spending years in education and not learning. However, also we shouldn't forget that many children were out of school anyways. So we haven't solved the problem of access, which needs to be still at the forefront, and we haven't yet solved the problem of learning. So still we need to continue to think about access and learning, which with COVID-19, the situation has been magnified in terms of the inequalities. Just the one that I would like to make a contribution here in terms of the work that we did in the Real Center. We had the opportunity to work with a very important and interesting program in Ghana called the Complementary Basic Education. And this program has been running for many years. Rukmini and Vikas and Rabia probably know about it. It's called School for Life. It started School for Life, providing alternative form of education, accelerated learning programs to children in the northern part of Ghana who have not been to school, life skill, local facilitator, local language. I mean, many of the elements that I hope we're going to touch later. And this program has been running for the last 25 years and expanded and scaled up with support from DFID and USAID. We came to do a study on 2 years following these children. And interesting, during these 2 years, these children spent 3 months out of the school when they finished their complementary education and then transitioned into government school. And what happened during this period we were able to assess the learning loss of these children and then start to see the extent of the inequalities. Interestingly, we asked questions to these children when we did this study, and we didn't know that there was going to be a pandemic, but we asked them whether they have television at home, whether they have radio at home, whether they have learning material and activities at home, or whether they have support at home from adults to be able to help them with their schoolwork. Now, what we found is that about 60% of what they learn on average is lost during these 3 months. And the Education Endowment Foundation had found in their latest systematic review that it could be somewhere between a third to a half of learning loss that children experience during summer. So it's not, a big estimate to say that it's about 60% of these children. Now, what you found here is that important findings, children who reported that they can get support at home have a much lower learning loss than children that couldn't get that support at home. Children who have materials which are reading, writing, and working with numbers at home, they have lower learning loss. Importantly, children who responded to our survey in terms of their understanding of the language used by the teacher, their mother tongue, they also had lower learning loss that we're measuring in literacy and numeracy. So, we are, as expected, seeing that there's going to be widening inequalities. There's going to be expansion. And just to give you the numbers here, only 15% of these children have television, 52% have access to radio, and 72% mentioned that there was a mobile phone at home, which interestingly, and we will know from the situation, is that the mobile phone is usually owned by one of the members of the households, sometimes one of the adults in the household, maybe two adults in the household. When you have strict lockdown, the children can access the mobile phone and they have the parents at home. As you ease the restrictions and the parents go out, then they cannot access any of this.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Again, a very interesting example there with real concrete points for us to think about. And actually, I thought one nice thing that you kind of clarified a little bit for us there is that there is two phrases sound similar, learning loss and learning gap, but actually they are two different things. Learning loss is something which happens, as you say, all over the world. But learning gap, so learning loss is what we lose when the schools are closed. The learning gap is the difference between those who have access to support and those who don't. So yeah, that was useful, that was kind of clarified. I'd like to thank you, all three of you, for your kind of introduction to this. I'd like to kind of open it up, and Charles or Vikas, if this prompted any thoughts from you, please add in.
Firstly, Ben, I thought it was an extremely interesting set of points, and thank you very much. Focusing on your learning loss point, what has struck me very much is 2 or 3 points. Point one, there's no doubt in my view that educational disadvantage has been massively increased through this process. Second, there's no doubt that it's been deeply variable for different children, that you can't say there's a consistent story. It's been very variable indeed. And why? Because 2 or 3 different factors have interplayed. First factor, what has been the parental involvement, the parental commitment, the ability of the parent to help the child during this period of lockdown. Second factor, schools have behaved very, very differently. Some schools have been absolutely outstanding, their head teachers, their governors really working hard to try and ensure that something is going on. Other schools have done something in a very formalistic way. I'm talking about the UK here, I can't talk more widely, without really doing it. And then thirdly, of course, the attitude of the child themselves and the extent to which they themselves really want to go for it. I'll talk in the next session about how I think one deals with these things, but the data that's coming through, surprising things. For example, the Office of National Statistics in the UK did an interesting survey a few days ago indicating that families where there was one child under 5 found it far, far more difficult to help the older children to learn in that situation because the parents' focus was on the needs of the under 5-year-old rather than on the older children. So what I really want to emphasize, Ben, is this highly variable nature of the way in which the education loss, the learning loss, has hit different individual students. And therefore, when we think further on in this conversation about what we do about it, that has got to be understood. There won't be one-size-fits-all solutions to really getting this right in the future.
Vikas, did you want to add anything as well?
Apart from what I've heard from our panelists, one thing that I came across this morning, and I fully agree with what Rukmini and Rabia have both said, which is we won't really know for a long time as to what the impacts and the implications are. One of the things that I saw this morning, thanks to Twitter, is how there are 6 new randomized control trials being put in place around the world to look at the impact of what has been spoken about in an extensive manner, which is the use of radio, TV, and various technological interventions to help children in various contexts. And I think that will be quite a fascinating thing that comes out of this.
Speaking of Twitter, and also Charles's comment about parents struggling with homeschooling their children. I remember, I think really early on in the lockdown, there was a tweet went viral, someone saying they had just completed 1 hour and 11 seconds of homeschooling. And now they feel that teachers should be paid $1 million an hour, because it's kind of given them an insight into how difficult it is to teach teach children. What I'd like to do now is to move on to what our response should be to these challenges and these problems. And really, in your context, or even more widely, what could we do, and what is being done which seems to be working? Possibly what things are being done which aren't working. How much catch-up is possible? I thought that's why I was really interested in the Pakistan example, because it kind of gives us an idea of how long this is going to go on, how long we're going to have to put in measures for this. So I think first of all I'll turn to Charles, if that's okay. What do you feel the response could be?
I think there are a number of points, Ben. First and most important is it remains important to open the schools again and to enable children to go to school. Certainly in the UK, it's been a highly contested area with the teacher trade unions, parents being worried and so on. But I think there's no doubt myself that even taking into account all the risk factors that are involved, for children to be able to attend school on a regular basis is a critical element in being able to move forward. But with these subjects, Ben, which I thought were very well covered by the people in this panel, in the first part of what we said, the question arises, is there a better solution than children being at school? And I really don't think there is. I think children getting back to school is a key point. Second, I think the whole question of the online provision, it's a long-term question as well, really needs to be looked at. In the UK, something called the Oak National Academy was established at the beginning of the COVID period, of a group of teachers and educators coming together to produce teaching materials online in a wide range, which hadn't happened before. I've had a look at it, and I think it seems very interesting and very positive, and was an initiative taken by individual teachers, school chains and so on, to try and establish something. But the truth is, if you take, even in England and Wales, the 25,000 schools in England and Wales, much smaller than some of the countries who are speaking in this group, you have highly variable capacity to be able to provide good online courses to the children who are at school. So I think that has to be the next major big step to address, and that's particularly important for recovering the losses which have already been made. And I think with that is various questions of remedial support. There's various ideas of teaching support over the school holidays in August, for example, and a whole series of particular measures that can be developed using that. But these are the steps which, in my opinion, need high priority. It's still in the UK controversial whether you open the schools or not, and that has to be solved. I think the final point about this is you asked the question, how hopeful or pessimistic are we that efforts in this area will be successful? I think I'm more pessimistic than optimistic in this area. A tremendous amount of effort needs to be put in. Organisations like Cambridge University Press can help do that and play their role, but there needs to be a wholly strategic approach. My impression in the UK is that strategic approach isn't there to the extent which it needs to be. My impression from what I've heard about some other countries is there is more of a strategic approach, but I think that strategic approach is absolutely central, focusing on getting the schools open and providing high quality online learning.
You know, I think governments need to do these 6 things to help fix these shortcomings that we are seeing. Firstly is to protect education spending. Secondly, to provide a one-off increase in spending to the schools that have been hardest hit by this learning loss. Number 3, invest in summer learning programs and and tutoring to help these students falling furthest behind. 4th, implement just-in-time learning assessments so that teachers can plan their lessons to accelerate the learning recovery once schools reopen. 5th, provide scholarships to keep children enrolled. And 6th, to develop various types of employment programs and lifelong learning opportunities for at-risk youths. And this is in addition to continue to address the ongoing public health emergency. These are 6 things that come to my mind. And just earlier today, in conversation with someone that a few of us know called Harry Petrinos at the World Bank, what they're doing, for example, in Turkey is of interest, where they're making an investment in three specific things to help the Turkish education system accelerate, which are to do with an investment in emergency connectivity and IT infrastructure, without which it's very difficult to have continuity in some circumstances. The second is the production of digital content. And the third, and I think the most important, is to build institutional capacity, which includes for coordination, management, monitoring, and evaluation, as well as for the continued delivery of safe and equitable digital education services. The capacity of departments or ministries of education do need to be strengthened, not only for immediate implementation of these kinds of emergency projects, but also to build the system of the future. One of the things that I think is a defining feature for me, and I take a point of difference in terms of to what Charles had said earlier, I don't think there is a debate about schools reopening, in that we all accept that schools need to reopen. And everything else that we're seeing is political positioning. But I think there's widespread acceptance that children need to be in schools, and we should be doing everything we can to make sure that they're there. The other thing that's happened during this pandemic, which I have seen, is in the absence of any policy thinking to deal with these kind of eventualities, I see a space being created for the teacher workforce to actually have an influence and an impact based upon what they are seeing at the front line. And I think that's been quite an interesting facet to the pandemic, where the trust, I would say, between policymakers, bureaucrats, and the teacher workforce has indeed, I think, improved, because we are, there was this feeling that we are in this together, and actually to trust the judgment of those people in charge and trained to deliver education, I thought was one of the things that came through, in abundance for me. In that situation, now that we have seen that teachers can innovate and respond, and often are should be seen as first responders, I would want to see that continue in any kind of dialogue that takes place about the future of education. We all accept that, no education system cannot outperform the quality of its teacher workforce. We know that intellectually, but do we know that practically? And I think this pandemic has shown us in spades again that that is the case. Now, when we talk about technology, and a few of us obviously have referred to it, apart from communications platforms like Zoom or Microsoft Teams, everyone was heralding the success of the education technology sector. I'm yet to be convinced. And I think one part of my hesitance comes from the fact that we need to make sure that we increase our investments in making sure teachers are better versed and equipped and prepared in the use and incorporation of these digital technologies through their pedagogy and the way that they manage their classrooms and the learning process. And for that, there's a greater investment required, I think.
Great, thanks. And I think next I'm going to turn to, I mean, there's a lot of points there I want to pick up, both Charles and yourself, Vikas, but let's hear from Rabea. I think you're going to give us your views on this.
Thank you very much. I agree with so many of the points that Vikas has mentioned. Actually, that's exactly key. I think sort of the principle that needs to be thought about is really identifying children at risk. And as has already been said, identifying the different types of risks that different children are facing. And then sort of coming up as far as possible, which is not an easy task at all, but to then think in terms of flexibility, which large education systems in developing countries often are not structured to do. There's often a lot of inertia. So I have a lot of sympathies, of course, with, you know, just the scale at which, say, even one provincial system in Pakistan functions at compared to it's the size of some countries. And the way that it's traditionally been structured is to direct top-down instructions, which has resulted over decades, you know, sort of the frontline responders waiting for instructions often. So there's almost this mindset shift that's required, this building of trust that's required, this signaling that there is faith in the teachers, their knowledge about the communities, their knowledge about the children themselves, and how sort of even within their classrooms, but within the communities of which schools are a central part, you know, sort of need to be brought together and need to sort of move forward. One example of that is, of course, when schools reopen, sort of getting children to come back to schools in villages in Pakistan, in villages in India, you know, in other places. I feel there's a need for not just a public campaign, and Rukmini has actually spoken about this at various other fora that I've heard her speak on, which is to say there needs to be a sense of celebration for when schools reopen, and just to let parents know that, you know, children are welcome again, that teachers and ministries and departments of education have prepared to welcome them back and sort of resume their education. But also at the same time, there may be a need for very targeted strategies for example, girls who may be at more risk of dropping out, as we spoke before. So can you think about interventions around, you know, SMS, telephone messages, cell phone messages to parents, which gives information about the kinds of stipend programs and scholarship programs that Vikas mentioned, right? So quite often parents are not even aware that there are ways in which, you know, in which their home situation may be helped, but the fact that the opportunity cost is actually lower than, so keeping the child at home is actually lower than what you might think. I think governments need to perhaps step up the scale of their scholarship programs, which links to the point about guarding education financing. I think it becomes very important to link social protection now with questions around how do you get, so conditional cash transfers perhaps, and other forms, other mechanisms that can sort of provide a safety net for a lot of the households. So I think in a recent survey in Punjab, it's come forth that close to 40% of households are reporting a loss in income and financial distress. So the scale of it, of this shock is going to be big, it's going to be multifaceted. So how do you think about sort of these things? On your point about sort of the pessimism and the optimism, the way I'd like to answer that in terms of how successful education systems may be in responding to this, the way I'd like to answer that is one thing we're seeing in Pakistan, and we have 4 provinces that are almost at different capacity levels also of governance and service delivery. The provinces that have put in sort of the effort to decentralize, to deepen sort of their workforces, to support schools as well, but also in in terms of fiscal autonomy of schools. So where you have mechanisms where school-based financing exists already, which is in Punjab and KP, which is 2 of the provinces, you have a ready mechanism where more resources can reach the schools very quickly. And the head teachers can now directly sort of access them and use them and leverage them to either bring more teachers into school or new kinds of teaching materials, etc. So in some ways, similar actually to how investments in health systems in certain states, and I've been reading about how investments that Kerala has made in its health infrastructure over the past few decades has now reaped benefits. We're seeing that for the past 10 to 15 years, if there's been investment in deepening sort of the governance structures, in decentralizing, providing more autonomy to the schools and to the teachers, now is the time that you're going to be able to reap those benefits very quickly. So that gives me optimism. I think other sort of systems are going to need to sort of work simultaneously to build both their capacity to respond as well as to come up with innovative responses.
Thank you very much, Rana. Vikas, do you want to come back?
Yeah, I just want to follow on from Rabia actually on the point that actually a few of your participants are flagging up in the chat function or the Q&A section to do with teacher training and capacity building. You know, on the 30th of May, I hosted a large conference aimed at teachers to talk about and to help them think about what the new normal may mean for them. And we went through a process to identify the key things that they wanted to discuss or learn about. And, you know, predictably, actually, there's a few areas like technology being obviously of great interest. What was interesting was they also chose collaboration. They also chose leadership. But the thing that actually blew me away and resonated so much, and this is what I think we should be very focused on because teachers are feeling this as well, is that, you know, when education systems actually focus on the well-being of their teacher workforce and think about all the different aspects of that, that I think generates incredible returns when it comes to building resilient education systems. And it's an area that, you know, is largely just ignored. Forget in developing countries, but in developed countries also. And so it's one area that I think that, you know, if I was an education minister listening to this, or if Cambridge University Press had the abilities to reach out to, is the one area that I would say needs significant investment.
Just a couple of points, Ben. I did actually agree with what Vikas said earlier. And by the way, I think a key point about, for example, opening schools isn't whether people think that schools should be open. They all think that schools should be open, but the determination with which they're ready to overcome the challenges they are to actually make that happen. And that comes back to the word I used earlier, strategy. Governments having a strategy to try and carry this through, to achieve the points Vikas made, but also Rabia's made about how you do it. And in this, I think a point that's missing in our conversation at the moment is timing. If you're talking about re-strengthening the whole of the teaching force in various ways, that is not something that can be done in a month. It's something that goes over a much longer period of time. So the strategy has to include what do you do short term and what do you do long term to carry it forward. And I think that's got to be a key element for any government, but also for levels much lower than government, even for an individual school, as to how you go about doing it. But I think the two key words for the new world are going to be resilience and sustainability. And those are going to be the things that every part of every education system is going to need to be able to achieve.
Thank you, Charles. And in some ways, that takes us neatly onto the third section, which is really the long-term perspective on this. And I think some of the things you've been saying have related to the long term as well. And I think I'm going to start off with Ricardo. Would you like to kind of start us on that? What opportunities does this give us for the long term?
Yeah, thank you. It fits really nicely what I was preparing to say and how this is taking us, because as Charles mentioned, there's going to be uncertainty for sure. So uncertainty is to remain, and therefore that's going to mark the future. Then that needs to mark obviously the provision of education, which is more resilient. I think there's also an agreement in terms of blended learning as being the future. But when we talk about this blended learning, and I would like to refer to an event, a two-day event that we have with the Real Center and fantastic partners collaborating in Rwanda on teachers, leaders in teaching. It's a project funded by MasterCard Foundation. And it was, first of all, incredible to see, number one, the innovation that is going on. So there is local innovation, local innovators, and potentially we know of cases in Tanzania, in Kenya, in Ghana, and Rabia can tell us cases that are happening in Pakistan and in many contexts of local people, young people that are innovating. And these innovations are very important because these are local innovations that take into account the local knowledge and what works. I think, blended learning programs have been massively accelerated in Rwanda, but they beg the question of, are we doing the right thing? Because we don't know whether these blended learning programs are going to work. We don't know whether they're going to work for the competence-based curriculum that Rwanda would like to utilize. We actually, and there are questions about, yes, we're scaling, but we don't know whether we're scaling in the right direction. So, there's been a massive increase in scaling, but we don't know whether that is going in the right direction. I also think that we knew a lot of what worked before. I think, Pratham showed us that community approaches were very important for improving learning. Accelerated learning, alternative educational provision, they're all shown to improve foundational skills and life skills. Programs that took into account local facilitators, local language of instruction, local knowledge. These programs that were developed to deliver the skills that are needed for the populations, for the children, for their livelihoods, that these were programs that enable learning. And I think we shouldn't forget, because these programs actually are still there. And I know that we're thinking about the whole machinery of the public education system, but at the same time, we know that some of these were important aspects to take into account when we're thinking about learning recovery. For the future, I think we have all said that no one size fits all. I think there's been good examples of different approaches. Just to mention a few, in the reopening of the schools, the teaching at the right level that has been, again, came through the work of Pratham and now implemented in many, many countries on the global south, is one that is very important for when schools reopen. Accelerated learning, there are a lot of really good examples about accelerated learning programs that have been very important in, at least I know the one in Ethiopia, Speed Schools, and I already referred to the one in Ghana, School for Life. I think it is important not to focus on an over-demanding curriculum. In the teachers trying to come and try to catch up as quickly as possible. That's not going to work. That's exactly what the study in Pakistan was pretty much pointing, that is not really the time out of school, but the path provision, which is already in a system that was not functioning. And then these children go to the system that is not functioning. There's no really learning taking place. Rabia mentioned assessment for learning. We need to assess these children. We need to understand the level at which they are, and then the teachers can work with that. In many cases, the teachers do assess the children. We have a project in India, and the teachers do respond, yes, we assess the children, but for what reason? We think that they assess the children to be able to teach them, but no, they assess the children because they are going to inform the sector education officers and the district education officers. That's what we assess the children. Well, that's, the way in which we think about the tools that we have for education have to be rechanged. And just to finish off with one thing that it was a little bit kind of in my mind in the way that we were talking about teachers, that they were also heavily impacted by the pandemic themselves. Nobody has been, we are affected. We are here. We have our children in the back. We're working in our homes. The teachers themselves have been affected. And just yesterday, I heard my colleague, Professor Nidhi Singhal, said that actually the future should come with compassion. We should also restart the system of education with compassion, because we were all affected by this crisis. So with that, Ben, I pass back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ricardo. Yes, very important. You know, one point I heard at a recent discussion was, I mean, a lot of countries' teachers they're not worrying so much about the pedagogy; they're worrying about getting paid. You know, and so there are some very basic challenges in the education system in some countries. Now, I'd like to pass on to Charles. Charles, could you also tell us what your views on where this is going long term, or where it could go?
3 points, basically, Ben, fairly straightforward. One, we've talked about a lot, the future of online education, whether you call it blended, how you discuss it, there needs to be far more work done on how to get high quality online education. I started discussion in this myself more than 20 years ago when I was a junior minister in education in Britain. It's been going on for a very long period of time. It needs to focus on the pedagogy, i.e. how you use the different forms of educational technology to help children. Much of the debate is actually dominated by the big marketing efforts of the major producers of educational technology for understandable reasons, but we have to really focus on that debate much more sharply. Secondly, something which I think is coming to highlight during this COVID crisis, which is the relationship with parents. Parents are partners in educating their children. They're not always seen as such. And I think that children at all levels of attainment will do better if the parents and the teachers are working together to understand the education that children are doing. I think there's insufficient work done on this dimension, and I think COVID has brought that through. It's a bit of an angle on what Ricardo was saying a second ago about community, one particular angle, the parents there. But I hope that one of the outcomes of this will be more thinking about how you build partnership, cooperation between teachers, parents, and their children to help children learn better. And that would create a far more resilient system in all the ways we're talking about. I don't mean just in the context of online, by the way, but very much more generally. There are many parents who feel completely locked out of the secret garden, which is their children's education with the teachers. The third dimension is one that everybody's already mentioned, so I won't labour a great deal, but we have to focus far more on supporting teachers. You can use the word training, training's fine, I'm in favour of training teachers, but you need to be able to support teachers far more. And I do think online has real possibilities to be able to train teachers much more quickly than exists at the moment. If you only focus on initial teacher training, by definition it takes 30 or 40 years to change the teaching force. You've got to move much more quickly than that by having high quality online teacher training, CPD, continuous professional development modules through which teachers can improve what they do. So those are my 3 things, Ben. 1, a good online strategy. 2, a strategy for engaging parents much more effectively. And 3, supporting teachers far more effectively, rapidly.
Vikas, would you like to come back on something? Yeah.
Sorry, there is one thing which I don't think has been said and is like the elephant in the room, and please forgive me for going on this tangent. If there was one bullet in education, one silver bullet in education systems that has a huge disproportionate impact system-wide, is for us to demand the best political leadership that we can have in education. Now, there's nothing contentious about that, but let me put this in context. If I just take the English education system, our Secretary of State for education over the last, I think even before Charles had taken that role, the average tenure of an education secretary is no more than 2.5 years. And so when we think about that as a position, we've got to think about investing longer term in making sure the political leadership in this very central function in education is also addressed, because it is from there that a lot of things are set in motion. And so that's why I think if there was one silver bullet with regards to fixing system-wide what happens, it is to demand more from our political leaders.
And I agree with that, of course, but I think it's not a silver bullet. I've discussed this at great length in different contexts, and your statistics are correct, but it requires a much more substantial discussion about the relationship of political leadership to professional leadership and a set of other issues. Another silver bullet people always use, you haven't, though you mentioned it a couple of times, Vikas, is funding. If only we could double the amount of money going into education, that would solve the problems. I don't think that's true. I'm in favour of doubling the money going into education, but I don't think that's the core issue. So I think there's a web of difficult issues which need to be taken on. Not to disagree, but to say one has to think about it in a way which really enables high quality, not just political leadership, but leadership at all levels. I mean, the number one is school leadership. High quality school leadership is the thing which transforms it for children. Question, how can political leaders create high quality school leadership? Difficult question. There's a whole set of interrelated questions. That's all I really want to say.
Thank you. And I don't even want to stop this, except I do feel an obligation to answer questions that have come in from the audience. And the first one is interesting because it's talking about long-term cultural change and the role of collaboration. And I think collaboration has come up a number of times within the community. The questioner here actually talks about the risk of nationalism versus and globalism and the kind of the move away from collaboration. But I'm wondering whether collaboration is more a community thing rather than a national thing. I don't know if you have a view on this.
Actually, from my experience, during the pandemic at least, what I've seen is, I think you're right to say that prior to COVID and prior to everyone becoming accustomed to these kind of platforms, we were very much restricted to what happens within the walls of our 4 classrooms or within our school. What I have found is the collaboration increasing by way of teachers having the opportunity to actually see for themselves and consult others and engage in discussion, productive and meaningful opportunities with their peers around the world. And I think that has been one of the defining features of what happens. And actually it leads me on to tell you about another project that I'm involved with called World Education Week. And the demand for this comes from exemplar schools around the world, which can exist in the global south as well as in the industrialized north, when we look at excellence. And so what's required for SDG 4, which is on quality education, in my opinion, is actually the effective sharing and collaboration between schools and teachers, because there's one thing that we do know is that teachers trust teachers and schools trust schools. And so if we can use these kind of opportunities of collaboration to drive learning outcomes and attainment in schools, I think that's a great thing. And that's what I'm seeing actually happen over this time and what the focus of World Education Week is.
Fantastic. I'm going to move on quickly to next question. I think I've got a feeling Ricardo might be the right person for this. So someone is asking about access to education and what can we do to support parents in hard to reach communities. And actually this, I'm not sure it's a man or woman, has said also, how can we promote autonomy without social relationships outside the family environment? So I feel this is about hard to reach communities where the family is actually key to education.
Yeah, I think and probably Rabia may want to come back also on this based on her research with girls and the very important aspects of context that drives a lot of the issues on access. I think the experience that we have is with respect to hard to reach communities. From the research perspective, what we have found is where these programs are being used and designed and really on a, and I want to bring here the word collaboration, on a collaborative way with the communities, then the access to education is more likely to take place. And that has been the success of many of the different interventions that we have. For example, the CAMFED model, the Campaign for Female Education model in Tanzania and in Zimbabwe. It works in a way in which they support girls in a much more holistic way, in a way that enables them also to build what we were saying, I think Vikas was saying, with transitioning into youth and employment, and then themselves being leaders, coming back into the community, being themselves role models for other girls in the community, which is also important for the support that is needed. So it's not only finance, and I agree with Charles, it's not just the money, although it is important for these communities, it's the other factors that are incredibly important in building the culture that is needed for this education. I just want to also mention one very quick point about this collaboration. I mean, in the collaboration, we're talking about, for example, EdTech and using of EdTech for continuous professional development. If we are serious about it, we really need to have first the collaboration of the teachers. They're the users. They have the knowledge. And actually, the EdTech providers have to come out a little bit of their we know how to do it and be able to understand how to do it with the teachers and be able to have a proper collaboration rather than a top-down approach. And I think this is where we're sometimes missing this. So with that, I don't know if you allow Rabia to come in or maybe go to another question, then back to you.
I would like Rabia to come in, but she might also tackle the next question as well, which is how can we make schools not a place of fear due to COVID? And I'm thinking of your mention about celebrating the return to schools.
No, thank you. Absolutely. I think that exactly as Ricardo mentioned, I think this is a multi-sectoral and all stakeholders will need to come together and sort of pull together. I think a lot of work needs to be done to organize conversations with teachers. So far, at least in Pakistan, if I was to give an example, and this links again with something Vikas said earlier, is that schools are functioning as units of sort of generating data to flow upwards. There's very little sort of data that comes back to the school. There are very few feedback loops that work in a way that teachers and school leaders are sort of the ones using the information to decide how they want to sort of innovate in their schools. So I think thinking about mechanisms, it's not going to be easy. It's quite a complex task there, but thinking about mechanisms that can set up communities of practice as locally as possible, that can include as diverse a set of stakeholders from the communities, from parents, from the teachers themselves. Some of the foundational infrastructure for this exists. It's just about sort of strengthening it. Another form of collaboration I think that needs to happen, which has proven to be really powerful, all of us have been referring to it throughout our conversation, is evidence on innovative models that is being generated by non-governmental organizations that have been involved in education for a really long time. Again, this is a conversation that's an uphill task for very large systems that need to reorganize themselves. So whether we think about teaching at the right level, which is an incredibly powerful concept, and I feel whichever elements of it can be taken and internalized in terms of what is needed to support children. So whether it's about thinking about their levels before thinking about whatever SLOs may have been set, thinking about sort of the diversity of options, the menu of options that teachers need without worrying about teacher guides that have been designed, say, in a provincial capital somewhere. So, you know, how do we start thinking in ways and producing sort of documents or menus of options, collaborations between the NGO sector and the government sector. I think it proved to be a really powerful sort of force forward in terms of just celebrating the school and just inviting everybody in, having a few fairs, you know, just a place of celebration.
And I love the fact that you delivered that with a call to prayer behind you in a kind of very appropriate way. Thank you very much. We've run out of time. Sadly, there are more questions, but we're going to have to close it. Thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you very much, Charles Clark, Rabia Malik, Ricardo Sabates, Vikas Pota, and Rukmini Banerjee, who's left us. It's been a fantastic talk. Thank you very much, and we hope all the participants have found it as useful as I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.